The Bible starts at the beginning. Literally, Genesis 1:1, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." So does the Gospel of John. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God." When you read the first verses of John, you are immediately reminded of Genesis 1:1. God here is Elohim, plural. God was in the beginning, and He created everything. In John we learn that the Word was in the beginning, that the Word was God, and then, in the next verse, that everything was created by the Word who is God. The beginning we have in John is the beginning of creation. Jesus, the Word, was present at that time. He was not created or only started to exist with his human birth. No, He pre-existed. Unitarians, those who do not believe that Jesus is God and that there is one God in three distinct persons, do not like this obvious parallel. So they come up with the idea that beginning here does not mean the beginning of creation, but what they call a new beginning, by which they mean Jesus' earthly life or ministry. They point out that the word beginning appears in other contexts as well, for example in Acts 11:15, where Peter, recounting his sharing of the gospel in the house of Cornelius, says, "And as I began to speak, the Holy Spirit fell upon them as upon us at the beginning." Now, here we have a clear context. The Holy Spirit falling at the beginning refers to Pentecost, the birth of the church. Or they point to Philippians 4:15, where Paul says, "Now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church shared with me concerning giving and receiving, but you only." Again, we have a context. It is the beginning of Paul's ministry in Philippi. Then they point to parallels in the Gospels of Mark and Luke. Mark 1:1, "The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." Now, this beginning here does indeed talk about Jesus' ministry. Mark goes on to talk about John the Baptist preparing the way for it. And in Luke 1 verse 2 we read, "Just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us." This here is talking about the disciples who followed Jesus in his earthly ministry from the very start. To infer that, since Mark and Luke are speaking of the beginning of Jesus' ministry, John's beginning must refer to the same thing, is wrong. John's Gospel is an account in its own right. Its focus is very different from that of the Synoptic Gospels. The fact that Mark and Luke speak of the beginning of Jesus' earthly ministry does not prove anything with regard to the definition of beginning that John had in mind. Those who make that inference start off with a belief that Jesus is not God. Consequently, they must then disprove that the beginning John talks about is the beginning. Whoever approaches the word like this disregards what it actually says and comes to faulty conclusions. John does not qualify the beginning he talks about. So there is no reason to claim he is referring to the beginning of Jesus' ministry. However, there are a number of reasons to assert that in fact he is talking about the Genesis beginning. To list all of them is beyond the scope of this video. The idea is to keep the episodes of this series short. But there clearly exists a parallel to Genesis 1:1, and there is no reason to assume that the beginning talked about in John is any other than the beginning of time, since there is no other context given. This being the case, we can indeed conclude, from John alone, but confirmed by the parallel verse in Genesis, that Jesus, the Word, pre-existed. He is God. A God who, while being one God, at the same time introduces himself in the plural form in the very first verse of the Bible. By stating that Jesus, the Word, was in the beginning, John stresses the eternal existence of the Son of God. He has no beginning in time.